Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the second day of the Disability and Rights, the Possibilities and Limitations of Rights Discourses under Neoliberalism conference, jointly organised by the Socio-Legal Studies Association and the Marxism and Disability Network. My name is Luke Beasley, and I will be chairing the first session of today. Before we get going, I'd like to start with a little bit of housekeeping. Firstly, we are running live captions and live BSL interpretation as part of the conference. If you require either of these, options to show captions or to see the BSL interpretive view will be available to you either in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen or under the menu with the heading More. So that's a button with 3 little dots and the word More. Click on those and you should be able to be sorted relatively quickly. We ask all participants to please send any questions or comments either directly to the chair of the session, in this case me, or preferably through the Q&A button. We also ask that you please do not use the group chat, so the chat function for the entirety of the conference, outside of the breaks. We have a number of attendees who are screen reader users, and every time a message goes in the chat, it's automatically read out by their screen reader. So it interrupts the speaker, it interrupts the discussion. So we ask you to be comradely and collegiate, and please use the chat respectively and responsibly. Furthermore, we have some tech support. So if you're having any difficulties with your audio, your video, what have you, please contact my colleague, Nell Osborne, and she will do whatever she can to help you out. Unfortunately, while Nell is immensely talented, she's not in the room with you. So please do understand that if the problem is with your equipment or your internet connection, she won't be able to help you. However, if it's a problem with the Zoom settings, she will do her best to go through ways that it could possibly be fixed for you. Okay, wonderful. Before going any further, I would also like to make a note to the speakers who are with us already. As we've noted, there is live BSL translation, so we ask you to please make sure you speak at a measured pace. Please do the best that you can, not to rush. We know you're excited about your topics, and so are we, but it's very important that our BSL users also get the full extent of your knowledge, and so speaking at a measured pace really, really helps in that regard. So, this first session is entitled Atomised and Underfunded, Resources Against Rights. Throughout yesterday's presentations, we kept bumping into a problem which we formulated in different ways according to the subject under discussion. And that was that our rights are restricted as disabled people, not only by not having resources allocated to liberatory strategies and phenomenon, but also because resources themselves are deployed against our rights. The people who restrict our freedoms, who tell us how our lives should be lived, often have access to huge amounts of power, money, labour, so on and so forth. And this session is designed to go deeper into that problem and to formulate a more coherent and a clearer understanding of the relationship between rights, resources, distribution, and institutions. So with that in mind, I am delighted to welcome our first speaker, Melvin Matthew Thomas. Melvin is a final year PhD scholar at the Manipal Centre for Humanities, where he weaves together sociology, literature, and disability studies to reimagine inclusive educational spaces. Melvin is passionate about mental health and education, and his work bridges creativity and scholarship, crafting pathways for empathy, resilience, and transformative learning in both academia and society. We are very delighted today that Melvin will be presenting his paper to us entitled Neoliberalism, Professionalism, and the Effective Politics of Mental Health in Indian Medical Education. So with no further gum flapping from me, Melvin, thank you very much. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much, Luke, and the entire team. I can't go on and on about it because that's how helpful you have been throughout this whole exercise, even to accommodate my time zones into your schedule. So very grateful to the entire team. Very, very thankful to you. Well, before I start off with the presentation, just a few some background information that I could provide. Well, this is one of the chapters that I'm writing for my thesis, and I am looking specifically at the intersection of medical education and mental health, specifically undergraduate medical students with one or more psychosocial disability during their educational period. So this is the way I start off is by understanding how there is a certain lacuna in scholarship that looks at the affective, the qualitative, the experiential aspects of psychosocial disability. You have a huge amount of scholarship that looks at burnout, that looks at suicide rates, that looks at substance abuse, and so on, which are very well done. But however, the voices, the lived experiences, the illness narratives are often kept aside in such scholarship. So my PhD, my dissertation largely looks at recommending policies to support the mental health of students during their undergraduate education, medical education. So my correspondents, my participants are the whole process took place through semi-structured interviews, and my participants were either in their third year or above of their 5-year medical program. And the reason for this was so that they could reflect on their 2 years of education prior to that, before articulating what they've gone through and how it's intersected with their mental health concerns, their diagnosis, and their interactions within academic spaces. So with that is the background I conduct this study from. And so my today's presentation, I'm going to switch between calling it a chapter and a presentation. It borrows from 4 select illness narratives that were shared with me during this process of collecting interviews and talking to students, and it informs the study from there. So yeah, I shall start. This chapter extends the dissertation's inquiry into psychosocial disability in medical education by examining the overlooked role of language. It posits language as an affective infrastructure that conditions what students perceive as institutionally permissible to articulate, what is left unsaid, and how certain expressions of vulnerability become legible in professional and academic spaces. Drawing from select interviews of undergraduate medical students with one or more psychosocial disability, the chapter explores how discourse operates simultaneously as a strategy of survival and as a mechanism of constraint. The narratives reveal how communicative choices within such contexts are rarely incidental. Rather, they could be shaped by A, student perceptions of institutional expectations, or B, students' diagnostic vocabularies and repertoire, and C, the perceived risks they think of when disclosing such concerns with a larger institution. So I shall straight away head to one of the narratives. I'm making it more narrative centric than academic with a lot of secondary sources, only because I'm aware of the diverse audience we have in our midst today. So I would try to make it lesser, heavy, denser on the academic aspect and more on the narratives that the students have shared with me. Just a small disclaimer, I've used pseudonyms to protect and maintain the privacy and confidentiality of the students. Sorry, so I shall head straight in. Ranjita, a 4th-year medical student, occupied her hostel study room during our online interview, fidgeting with her pencil for most parts, her movements quickening whenever the conversation touched upon something she might have found unsettling. When they ask me how I am, I usually say, I'm managing. When they ask me why I'm quiet, I say, I'm just tired. The replies, they're never lies, I swear, but they are like airlocks. Ranjita paused briefly as she went to retrieve the pencil that managed to bounce a couple of times on what seemed like a hard floor before rolling away. As she returned to her seat, she elaborated, if I open up with the real answer, everything would just flood in. Honestly, I don't even know what to say, how to describe it, or what the right words were. You get tired each time you fail to communicate it properly. The situation then feels more hopeless, so I keep it airtight and balanced. Managing becomes a constant thing, like a room with no windows. I feel tired and suffocated very often. As her voice tapered off, Ranjita's gaze shifted to the glass wall separating the room from the corridor, where the blurred silhouettes of her peers in white coats passed by. This experience by a student medic sorry, This experience by a medical student from Dharwad brings to light the central paradox this paper wishes to explore: how language serves simultaneously as a means of survival and a source of constraint for medical students living with psychosocial disabilities. Ranjita's metaphor of airlocks in this context could be understood as linguistic spaces that mediate between her inner experience of distress and her perception of what the institutional expectations are, in thereby capturing the dual role of language in medical education. To elaborate further, within this context, language does more than just describe. It shapes what can be expressed, how it could be potentially perceived, and how this information is then perceived as acceptable or legible within the norms of medical education and practice. In other words, Ranjita's attempt to balance pressure within such an airlock could possibly be seen to mirror the tension between embodiment and institutional legibility, where self representation could be read as a careful yet uncertain negotiation with the system she wishes to professionally excel in. So the chapter is analyzed thematically, and there are 6 themes that have emerged from the narratives. However, for today's presentation, I'm just going to be looking at 2 that's very central to our closer inspection of neoliberalism and its impact. So I will just list out all the 6 first,
So sorry,
in case.
Sorry, if you could just go a tiny bit slower, then that would be brilliant. Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry. The nerves get the better of me at times. I do that in class as well, so sorry about that. There are 6 themes that have emerged. However, for today's presentation, I will be sticking to just 2. I will anyway list out the 6 in case any of you wish to bring it up during the Q&A. The first one is grammar of coping. It explores how phrases like "I am managing" indicates various aspects of distress while simultaneously conforming to the commonly perceived institutional expectations. The second theme, I look at the medical gaze, which is turned inwards. It examines the internalization of clinical language as both as an interpretative lens as well as a potential emotional distancing mechanism. 3, the tone modulation and epistemic erasure. It analyzes the adaptation and cultivation of a certain doctorly tone as a performative practice one could carry to potentially erase some or most of the emotional undertones that exist. 4, somatization as a means of communication. This theme sheds light on how bodily symptoms could potentially be alternative semiotic systems for articulating psychosocial concerns. Number 5, queerness and the consequence of absence. This theme addresses how linguistic omissions around non-normative identities contribute to certain epistemic marginalization. And number 6, the most crucial to today's presentation, wellness, in quotes, wellness and its discontents. This critiques the neoliberal co-option of mental health discourse into a certain performative and a little depoliticized practice. In doing so, the chapter wishes to highlight the limitations of dominant institutional language by pointing out to the transformative potential of reimagining discourse as a dynamic site for negotiation, both personal and collective forms of resilience. Straight away to the narratives and its analysis. Arshi shared how she had started journaling during her 3rd year of medical education. Initially, it functioned as a record of daily events, a logbook of what she had studied, ate, and how she slept. Over time, it assumed a different role. I started writing down everything under the sun: what I thought of others, of myself, what the symptoms could mean. And then I had this very addictive app for noting early mood changes during my downers, period cycles, especially PMS, including water intake. I would even rate my sadness on a scale of 1 to 10. If I had nightmares or remember my dreams, I would note those too. Arshi shared how this task would in several times help her find her lost interest in medical education. She would write about people she liked and disliked alongside clinical terms she learned to dislike and like. In other words, what might have started in humor became increasingly shaped by clinical forms of reasoning and categorization. I'd use proper medical words: psychomotor retardation, somatic symptoms, so many of them. Sometimes I'd even sketch out possible diagnosis, like maybe MDD, question mark. It helped to have it all written down, she said. Yet, rereading these older entries prompted a sense of uncertainty. Sometimes it felt like I was reading about someone else. The words sounded too medical at times. I'll read that again. The words sounded too medical at times. Eventually, I couldn't even tell what I was really feeling. I think I got too immersed in it. That is why I used the word addictive earlier. And with my condition, this is only going to mess with my attention further. All day and night, there was something or another to track, not necessarily to live by. Arshi's reflection pointed to the ways in which clinical vocabularies could extend into spaces presumed to be private. What had begun as a reflexive practice appeared to have become a mode of self regulation. Could then the diary have become a site where some of the tools of medical training, such as classification, objectivity, detachment, refigured the self? Arshi's narrative opens up questions about how clinical reasoning, once internalized, might possibly reorder the terms through which one perceives the self. The diary, probably shaped by both institutional training and personal need, did not merely log in experiences. Instead, it appeared to reconstitute it. What counted as feeling, what could be traced as a symptom, and what remained inarticulable were all subtly governed by a language which was not entirely her own. The practice, without eliminating uncertainty, gave Arshi's concern some form. Moving on, the other narrative, the audit culture. We had to submit a wellness reflection form. I remember this one particular form. Varun, a final year medical student, said. They made us fill it after a workshop. I don't remember the exact title of the workshop, but then they said, write how the session changed your understanding of stress and distress. I left it blank. He paused before clarifying. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because nothing actually changed. We all knew what was causing the stress. That did not need rocket science. The form, in this instance, became the potential medium through which institutional intent and student experiences might have become in a certain form of disharmony. Varun elaborated on how, just prior to this workshop, he had completed a clinical rotation with unpredictable hours. During this period, he described missing meals, falling asleep during lectures, and to his surprise, receiving feedback that his motivation and confidence seemed very low, almost in a diagnostic tone. They wanted to hear that we were inspired by the workshop, he explained, but the only thing I learned that week was how much worse I felt after it. The session, structured as a set of exercises on time management and affirmations, had been followed by compulsory submissions of a self-assessment mandatory Google form with identifiable markers such as name, roll number, that's the registration number, phone number, email address, badge, and so on. He shared how each participant was expected to submit this form in order to obtain the completion certificate for the mandatory extra competency module that was given. In this context, the shift from attending a workshop on wellness to reporting on the participant's present state might suggest a subtle transition in how wellness might be commonly perceived and evaluated. What had been framed as self care now might have appeared as a performative task. I thought my name would be marked down if I argued, or if I wrote something else, Varun said. So I just put on this one line. I will try to rest more, he said before laughing, his tone and sentence carrying undertones of a certain resignation. He perceived implausibility of rest had shifted to a language of effort or lack of effort thereof. In other words, Varun's submission reflected what he anticipated would be read as appropriate and not necessarily what he had actually felt. The practice of reflection in medical education has often been framed as a pedagogical tool. Yet, in this context, it risks becoming regimes of audit. Anna Singh's work could shed some light in this context, where she looks at audits as a system in which compliance with defined standards and ideals, such as ethical, environmental, or quality norms, is ensured through formalized monitoring, documentation, and verification processes, often enforced by external regulatory bodies. These practices create the appearance of transparency and accountability, but may also mask underlying inequalities. In Varun's context, this could be seen as a mechanism that shifts learning from being experiential to one that becomes reportable. In other words, the act of reflection seemed detached from the pedagogical function. They didn't ask how I was, just whether I had filled the form, and later if I had got the certificate to pass the course, he said. I will move on to the next narrative because I think we're short of time, the last one. The wellness paradox. At the end of it, we had to smile and look all pretty for the campaign photo. Muskan adjusted her screen and exhaled. They wanted us to smile for the Wellness Week campaign and so many other things. I remember standing in that line, sweaty, right after my ward duty, holding a placard that said, I choose well-being. She chuckled. I didn't fucking choose anything, but I faked the most number of smiles that day, I know. Muskan shared how the campaign, launched in her college just after a series of reported burnout cases, was framed as a success that warranted immediate celebratory photographs. We had different events, each one called a milestone, and each milestone would have taken an hour or less to complete. And then there were a hooray photograph at every milestone. You see where this is going, don't you? She described how she and her peers were asked to participate in a poster making competition, photo booths, and group pledges, recalling being told that attendance was mandatory for all sessions. We hadn't even slept properly that week. It was very close to our exams, but everyone was there early in the morning so that we could achieve all the milestones. She used air quotes to say milestones. So we could achieve all the milestones before we could focus on the exam. It was all very colorful, with these slogans stuck on cardboards. Some didn't even make sense. She narrated how the photographs were captured, students holding affirmations, circulated through the college's social media handles without any consent. The photographs were then geotagged and emailed to regulatory bodies such as NMCs and UGC with quote unquote funky sounding hashtags, as she describes. My cousins and friends saw the post on Instagram and messaged me saying, You look so happy. But what the heck is hashtag smile for well-being, hashtag poster perfect poses, hashtag milestone magic? I remember thinking, yeah, I do. I look like I had it all together that day. This narrative may reflect on what Sarah Ahmed describes as the institutionalization of diversity work through the creation of happy images. In her work on being included, Ahmed examines how universities institutionalize diversity. This, she argues, carries a symbolic gesture, including the production and circulation of happy images. This could include photographs of happy and demographically diverse individuals in promotional university materials, as well as in their public relational campaigns. Ahmed argues how these images serve to visually signal an institution's commitment to diversity, but they often mask inequalities without producing substantive systemic change. In Muskan's context, the wellness campaign produced curated representations of student well-being that could have been in direct contrast to their lived realities. While discussing support systems, Muskan described a classmate who had excused herself from the event citing a headache. Next week, a professor asked her in class if she was adjusting well to the clinical postings. I don't think she was even honest about the headache. The comment, Muskan believed, was linked to her absence from the campaign event. This subtle interaction may indicate the ways in which participation in wellness discourses can function as an unspoken proxy for professionalism. In her regard, not to engage, however symbolically, might risk interpretative consequences. We all smiled for the photo. In the days that followed, Muskan recalled how the posters remained on the display boards even as her distressing factors remained unchanged. The campaign for her might have become a reminder, not of wellness, but of its performance. In other words, her account might point to how wellness initiatives, when rooted in visibility rather than support, risk transforming care predominantly only for optics. Muskan's story suggests that the image reporting becomes the intervention, and that the language of well being, when detached from careful introspection, can reproduce the very silences it intends to address. Just the concluding remarks. I hope I'm okay on time, just for 2 moments. This chapter positions institutional language in medical education as a two-edged sword. One, it showed how affective expressions found in the narratives were predominantly structured through clinical acceptable terminology. Two, it simultaneously necessitates the need for alternative, often embodied forms and spaces of communication, especially when existing frameworks prove inadequate for support and accommodation. as seen in the narratives, when such linguistic frameworks are unable to capture the complexity of psychosocial distress, communication takes a different route. Physical symptoms such as headaches, gastrointestinal discomfort, or chest tightness begins to function as alternative ways of signaling distress. These bodily expressions stand in for words, and they possibly challenge any rigid demarcation between the mind and the body. In this context, the body becomes both as a site of communication and a form of critique for issues pertaining to psychosocial concerns, drawing attention to what is perceived as unsaid or unacknowledged within institutional discourses. Furthermore, the last para, the narrative suggests that the expectation to display resilience, especially when it seems to be tokenistic in nature, as in reflection forms or public wellness campaigns, are found in the narratives, can obscure the actual challenges of medical training and divert attention from a broader structural factors affecting student well-being. In addition, these dynamics could also intersect with the ways in which care and wellness are framed within the larger ethos of the institute and the market. As the narratives indicate, initiatives that focus on self-reported growth or require visible participation could prioritize documentation and appearance over substantive support. In such an environment, students may comply with what is expected while developing their own less visible strategies for managing distress. The result could possibly be understood as a form of negotiated and relational resilience, shaped by the ongoing interplay between perceived institutional scripts and embodied realities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melvin. An excellent paper and very much appreciated. I'm delighted now to welcome our second speaker, Stefan Sunandan Honish, and I hope I haven't over-Germanized that. Stefan is currently a sessional lecturer in the Department of Theatre and Film and is a scholar in residence at St John's College at the University of British Columbia. Stefan's first monograph, Vulnerable Virtuosities, Disability in Concert and Competition, is currently under contract with the University of Michigan Press. And Stefan's articles appear in the Journal of Inclusive Education, the Journal of Teaching Disability Studies, Theory and Event, and the Journal of Popular Music Education. Stefan has further contributed book chapters for the Oxford Handbook of Music and Disability Studies and to Defining the Boundaries of Disability, Critical Perspectives. Stefan serves as the section editor for the peer-reviewed open access journal Postcolonial Text. And we're very happy this morning to hear Stefan's presentation entitled Neoliberal Ends Justify the Means Test, Disability and the Benefits of Poverty Management in Canada. So with no further ado, I'd like to invite Stefan to pop that camera on and take us away, please.
Thank you very much, Luke. Neoliberal ends, it seems, justify the means test. Touted by the champions of, quote, fairness and efficiency, which is to say austerity, the means test subjects its beneficiaries to what George Orwell describes in his 1937 book, The Road to Wigan Pier, as, quote, a disgusting public wrangle about the minimum weekly sum on which a human being can keep alive, close quote. Yet variants of this disgusting public wrangle are endemic in neoliberal welfare states, including Canada. The federal government's Canada Disability Benefit provides an egregious case study in means-tested poverty management under the banner of quote-unquote personal empowerment and exemplifies what Martha Russell describes as the quote failure of liberalism, unquote. Equality and liberation are unattainable within a rights-based disability politics because capitalist exploitation and oppression arise in the economic rather than political sphere, and because means-tested welfare programs reinforce capitalism's long-term stability. Moreover, the focus of neoliberal rights discourse on anti-discrimination, positioning diversity, inclusion, and sometimes accessibility as standalone goals, rationalizes the inhuman calculations which means-tested programs require, instead apportioning poverty and wealth in demographically accurate and merit-based ways. The disability justice principles of anti-capitalist politics, collective access, and collective liberation hold promise as an alternative discourse. To the extent that intersectional analysis, quote, can absorb class into the neoliberal theory of inequality, close quote. However, and that's a quotation from Walter Ben Michaels. Disability justice faces the difficult task in the face of global injustice of struggling towards wealth redistribution and poverty eradication in the existential fight for the public good. A recent New York Times Magazine article about Canada's medical assistance in dying program succeeds where much journalistic coverage fails, namely in drawing attention to the serious ethical issues that confront people who apply for the program known colloquially by its acronym MAID, MAID, and the medical professionals who assess individual applications based on the program's existing criteria. The article in the New York Times discusses the extreme poverty which pushes many people to find a way out of their suffering and isolation. Holding a mirror up to Canada's federal uh, and policy environment, it shows the extent to which governments, like corporations, prioritize money over people's lives. Quoting from the article, uh, a report released by the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimates that Bill C-7 would save the provincial governments an estimated $149 million annually in net healthcare costs, close quote. Tellingly, however, the public is on to what this country's ruling classes are up to. Again, quoting from the New York Times article, by February 2023, a poll by the Angus Reid Institute showed that more than half of Canadians, 55%, say they worry about the medical assistance in dying program taking the place of improvements in social services. What brought us to this catastrophic point, and what is the way away from means-tested catastrophe and towards a future worth its name? Even a short history of the dehumanizing policy choices that have brought us here is well beyond this paper's scope. My chosen method is instead to recapitulate questions that capitalism's latter-day critics have asked for years. These questions taken together encompass the globality of our present predicament. If a basic definition of capitalism places emphasis on its private ownership of the means of production, then a basic conception of the welfare state that, among other things, secures capitalism's own long-term welfare, a point emphasized by both Margot E. Salomon and Vivek Chibber, should underscore its managerial ownership of the means testing. In his preface to James Burnham's 1941 book, The Managerial Revolution, Michael Young summarizes its basic premise thus, quote, capitalism will be overthrown not so much by the proletariat as by the new class of managers who will gradually, in one country after another, gain control over the state and the instruments of production, close quote. It is worth recalling that Burnham's work inspired Orwell's own vision of the quote unquote hellish places. That's from Orwell's 1944 phrase, 1944 essay rather, in titled "As I Please," to which the so-called managerial class might guide us with superb efficiency. To the question of what Tanya Tchaikovsky calls disability access, the answer is too often still an unadorned no. From this answer, a predictable question follows. Why? When this question is not simply ignored, a host of responses and evasions follow, each in their turn. Especially popular among the latter are heartrending appeals to some metaphysical budget and its necessary limits. Cost comes before care with great predictability in Canada. In Canada, this managerial imperative goes by many names: transparency, accountability, and fiscal responsibility. Even as disability access remains deniable, what Walter Ben Michaels calls equality of access to markets is an undeniable priority, no matter the flavor of neoliberalism a given ruling party happens to dole out within a given election cycle. The deep connection between the denial of disability access as a measure of fiscal responsibility and the consequent inequality of opportunity for disabled people to participate in the life of our communities is driven home by Inclusion Canada. Quote, the most common response to the employment needs of people with an intellectual disability is placement in a so-called sheltered workshop or day program, where people are typically paid only a small weekly stipend of about $5 to $10, if anything at all. This results in exclusion from meaningful paid employment in the community, leaving most Canadians with an intellectual disability unemployed or significantly underemployed. Close quote. The dedication of Canada's ruling classes to capital needs and market access stands in marked contrast to the mundane concerns of grassroots organizations such as People First of Canada with human needs and disability access. The contrast is instructive. Consider, for example, People First of Canada's stated commitment to, quote, making sure people with intellectual disabilities have real work for real pay and that wages and benefits are the same as those of people without disabilities, close quote. Canada's provincial and federal governments have, for decades, transcended their real or imagined ideological differences to find common ground in a larger cause, undertaking a multi-front onslaught against the public good using the economic foundations of capitalism, which generate poverty, to design and implement concrete policies which manage poverty. The consequences for the public are a cost of living crisis that has transformed housing, medical care, food, and clothing into luxury goods. Walter Ben Michaels provides a helpful starting point for understanding neoliberalism's history in his 2015 book, The Beauty of a Social Problem, Photography, Autonomy, Economy. He writes, quote, in Canada at the beginning of 1982, the unemployment rate was 8.6%. By the end of the year, it was 13.1%, close quote. In 2025, in Canada, the unemployment rate is approximately 7%. This is according to a recent CBC News article. Given the meanness of Canada's local, provincial, and federal policies, and given capitalism's seemingly unshakable grip on public life, nothing less than universalism will suffice in answering the question of access with a generous, solidaristic yes. Neoliberal ends, which naturally begin in fiscal responsibility, justify a means-tested approach to access to nominally public goods and services, a deeply ethical approach that I characterize, as noted earlier, as poverty management. To begin naturally with fiscal responsibility is to end unnaturally in misery. Orwell's withering analysis of the means test cited earlier for its emphasis on the quote-unquote minimum weekly sum that the state should spend to keep someone alive, bears an instructive parallel to a passage concerning the minimum wage in the Communist Manifesto of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. Quote, the average price of labor is the minimum wage, i.e., that quantum of the means of subsistence, which is absolutely requisite to keep the laborer in bare existence as a laborer. What, therefore, the wage laborer appropriates by means of his labor merely suffices to prolong and reproduce a bare existence, close quote. There are two obvious alternatives to medical assistance in dying becoming the desperate means of escape from the economic suffering documented in the New York Times article cited earlier. Both alternatives are implicit in a series of questions that Martha Russell posed years ago in her aptly titled Dollars and Death. Quote, is it humanistic to assist people to a premature death when they suffer ugly economic circumstances and social conditions and need help from society to get through a difficult time? Isn't it humanistic, rather, to fight for resources and social justice and to avoid death as the social solution? Close quote. The first would be for policymakers to end all means-tested social services, returning to whatever commitment to universal programs that federal, provincial, and territorial governments may once have had, or at least pretended to have had. The second way out lies along an arduous path of collective struggle for those who are exploited by capitalism and those who are not, but who also suffer the results of its commodification of life, to come together around shared interests. Not only the specific ones of workers, such as improvements to working conditions, a living wage, paid parental leave, but also more ambitiously around the universal programs in housing, medical care, food, and education that would benefit workers and the unemployed alike, by definition transcending the social hierarchies that the political economy of capitalism mobilizes to such profitable and devastating effect. That managing poverty in Canada has long required a whole-of-government approach is illustrated in Sherry Torchman's 1996 parenthetical observation regarding the Canada Pension Plan, namely that the maximum payment allowed is, quote, actually lower than most provincial welfare rates, and welfare itself falls well below the poverty line throughout the country, close quote. Canada's welfare system is, in short, a poverty trap, carefully crafted and expertly managed. Here I quote from a 2023 Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives report by Kendall David and Megan Linton, quote, policy, both federal and provincial, forces most people with disabilities in Canada to live in chronic abject poverty, close quote. Equity, diversity, and inclusion statements and policies under the forever unfolding banner of anti-discrimination will not solve economic inequality. Its benefits too often merely trickle sideways, a point made by sociologist Vivek Chibber. There's a more fundamental problem with anti-discrimination noted by Walter Ben Michaels, who points out that its aim is, quote, not to eliminate or even mitigate the gap between the rich and the poor, but to justify it, to make sure that the rich deserve their wealth and the poor deserve their poverty, close quote. Justifying poverty and wealth as the diverse results, respectively, of good and bad choices, neoliberalism's favorite menu, depends significantly on a convenient misreading of Michael Young's 1958 neologism, meritocracy, a misreading shared by apologists for neoliberalism across the ever narrower ideological spectrum. The anti-capitalism politics and solidaristic energy of disability justice have not gone far enough beyond what Karl Marx impatiently terms the narrow horizon of bourgeois right. This is from his critique of the Gotha program. Its constraints remain a barrier to the universalist aims of disability justice in striving towards collective liberation. Canada's approach to social services inverts Marx's 1875 formulation, also from his critique of the Gotha program, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. Rushing to the aid of capitalism's winners, our revised and updated version in Canada runs approximately thus. From each according to their disability, for each according to a needs test, means test, or income test. Although I cannot pursue this in detail here, the preface to a 2015 special issue of Canadian Journal of Disability Studies questions Marx's pithy formulation in his critique of the Gotha program, but in doing so raises questions of its own. Bonita Heath asks, quote, would an economy based on Marx's ethos be an ideal approach to social inclusion that could end disability poverty? Heath further wonders if Marxian philosophy could, quote, undermine our aspirations for equality and dignity, close quote. These questions, however, conflate the neoliberal goal of equity, which is perfectly compatible with inequality, perfectly at ease with managing poverty, with the socialist, and in the case of Marx's critique of the Gotha program, communist, one of reducing and ultimately ending poverty. Heath Forward also, however, carefully notes internal debates among disability studies scholars about the difference between exclusion and exploitation, although a clearer distinction between class as a material relationship and social identities might place this account on firmer ground. The difference between the minimum wage for laborers and the Canada Disability Benefit meted out to its beneficiaries is that the latter, $200 per month plus provincial clawbacks, is well below the quote-unquote absolutely requisite to live in poverty. In this respect, it is very much of a piece with the total compensation available to disabled workers in the so-called shelter workshops that I discussed earlier. A word about clawbacks. These have their origins naturally in the splendid accelerating neoliberalism of the 1980s, as shown by Sherry Torchman in the 1996 report that I referred to earlier. Here, once again, it is worth recalling an essential part of the meritocratic society satirized by Michael Young in his 1958 book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, namely, quote,
I'm so sorry to interrupt. We're just running over time. Is it possible to sum up within the next 45 seconds to a minute?
Thanks, Luke. In that case, maybe I'll just skip ahead to can I just read the closing page of my paper?
If you can keep it as short as possible, that would be great.
Okay. I'll just yeah, I'll just read the last paragraph then. At the outset, I referred to the globality of our predicament. To close, I would like to leave you with the cautionary notes sounded by Arundhati Roy in the introductory essay "Democracy's Failing Light" for her book Field Notes on Democracy: Listening to Grasshoppers. Arundhati Roy notes that justice has come to mean human rights, and of those, as they say, a few will do, close quote. Roy reminds us of the immiserating limits of rights-based claims. In the essay's closing pages, she recalls a verse by the poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz, helpfully including both the original and her own translation. First in Urdu, नहीं निगाह में मंजिल तो जुस्तजू ही सही नहीं विसाल मयसर तो आरज़ू ही सही. And Roy's translation into English: if dreams are thwarted, then yearning must take their place. If reunion is impossible, then longing must take its place. If universal programs are thwarted, then must means-tested neoliberalism take their place? Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thanks very much, Stefan. I'd like to invite Melvin to come back on camera, and then we'll put both of our speakers in the center of the screen, if someone could be so kind. And we will get to the Q&A. Now, I have a lot of questions in for both of you, which is one of the reasons I had to be so cruel about time. So I'm going to start off with a question for Melvin, if I may, from one of our attendees, who wonders if you could expand upon how your participants, as medical students with disabilities or disabled medical students, understand their own experience. Sorry, the question just disappeared and I've got it. Understand their own experience with disablement in terms of the social model and medical models of disability, especially with respect to any productive tensions between the two models. And the participant would also love to know how you further connect with and keep up with your academic work as they're starting graduate school in autumn, and will be doing research on Filipino migrant and immigrant disabled healthcare workers in Canada. Sorry, is that clear, or do you need me to sum that again, Melvin?
Thanks, Luke. Thanks, Jasmine, for this wonderful question. Well, that was the first point where, wait, sorry, give me a second. How do I answer this? These are students who communicate, who inhabit a certain language, a certain biomedical jargon heavy language. And that obviously and organically leads them to an understanding of the medical model of disability. So that was the first point of juncture where I had to tell them, my first question during the interviews were, what does mental health mean to you? What does mental wellness mean to you? And at various occasions with different various participants, I had them responding by saying, according to the definition, and I would say, stop, stop, stop. We all know what the definitions mean. What does mental wellness mean to you? So that became the most crucial point, where I told them there are no right answers and wrong answers. They're trained in a very objective. It's either this diagnosis or that diagnosis. You have too much hemoglobin or too less platelets. You have set numbers to define what an illness is. But like I said, like menstrual cramps or pain in general, each one experiences them differently. So to shatter that and to tell them to center their experiences, the first question, what does mental wellness mean to you, became very important. So that was the first part where I could break that medical model to move slightly more into the social model of disability. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks very much, Melvin. Now, a question for Stefan. One of our attendees wonders if you could expand a little bit more on the relationship between meritocracy, neoliberalism, and disablement that you highlighted in your study. Is there anything further that you would feel comfortable saying about that at this point?
Thanks very much for the question. I'll do my best to respond concisely. It's an excellent question. I would say that pulling together the concept of meritocracy, first developed by Michael Young in 1958 in his book, The Rise of the Meritocracy, it's worth emphasizing his satirical intent in developing the notion of a society in which, instead of wealth and privilege and opportunities being inherited through through one's family, for example, that a society would emerge in which wealth and success and career opportunities were parceled out on the basis of what he refers to often satirically as merit. The connection with neoliberalism and then its further linkage to disability. Walter Ben Michaels in The Beauty of a Social The Beauty of a Social Problem, that's a reference to Bertolt Brecht. The notes for Mother Courage that Bertolt Brecht wrote. That's a tangential note, but Walter Ben Michaels makes the point that to the extent that a commitment to representation seeks to ensure not that we get rid of wealth concentration and that we get rid of poverty, but instead to make sure that the right percentage demographically of a given population is poor, the right percentage or the demographically representative percentage is rich, poor, in executive positions in corporations and so forth. None of that is at all incompatible with neoliberal commitments to sustaining capitalism. And so this then has impacts for how we think about disability as in addition to a way of being in the world and as a positive identity that one might wish to claim. In addition, as Canadian government policy shows, and from what I've been reading about the situation in Britain, for example, under the Labour government, it seems abundantly clear that the the ruling elites can convince themselves that current policies are merit-based in some sense, that those who receive whatever assistance governments and philanthropic groups dole out are somehow deserving, and those who starve, those who suffer somehow deserve what they experience.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. And my apologies if you heard some clicking. I was just dealing with some messages coming in around something. Okay, I'm going to combine a question. We've got a number of questions on a similar theme that I'm going to put to both of you as a composite. A number of participants noted that you were both in different ways discussing the power of conceptual and discursive frameworks related to rights, well-being, welfare, what counts as a good life. In your case, Melvin, the university management case were imposing an understanding of well-being on the students that you dealt with, and the students were articulating their own language to resist it, namely the language they used when speaking to you. In your case, Stefan, the neoliberal management case and the state welfare elites and bureaucracy were imposing their understanding, very limited form of what kind of life is worth living. And then disabled people, including the DPOs you mentioned, People First Canada and so forth, were articulating their own discursive frameworks to try and resist that, to make a kind of counter sense of it. A number of participants wonder where other agencies or other social forces could intervene, where you think helpfully terms, conceptual frameworks could be borrowed to aid resistance, to help articulate a counter language of rights, well-being, human flourishing. Are there places in the NGO sector, in the workers' movement, for example, that you think disabled people facing the kinds of oppression that you've outlined should be looking for ways to understand their own experience and strategize their own resistance? I'm going to start with Stefan first, and then I'm going to move to yourself, Melvin.
Thanks very much for the question. And my previous response went rather longer than I intended, for which my apologies. In this case, I'll try to be less windy. I think there are, in the full version of my paper, I discussed the Canadian Labour Congress. So in, I think, 2024, they came out with a statement in solidarity with disabled people in Canada, and specifically a statement denouncing the Canada Disability Benefit as entirely inadequate. So in terms of a discursive framework, a counter language, I think that the Canadian Labour Congress offers one example in Canada of an organization that, both in terms of its language and its policy positions, but then also in some sense in a more active way. I'm hesitant to draw too stark a distinction between language and action, or language and practice, but at the risk of overdrawing that distinction, nonetheless, what I would say is that the Canadian Labour Congress offers a way forward in showing its willingness to be in solidarity with disabled people who are facing circumstances of oppression that may differ in key ways from people employed in the workforce, but also point to an understanding of basic needs as universal concerns. And I think that in Canada, we do have at least one potent example of what that kind of solidarity might resemble, and how it could then be used as the basis for further action.
Thank you very much. Melvin, if I could ask you, and I'd just ask you to stick to as close to 2 minutes as you possibly can. Oh, you're muted, Melvin. Melvin,
Sure.
you remain.
Yeah,
Oh,
I'm
there you
sorry.
are.
I'm sorry. Yeah. Medical education in India is it's very expensive, one of the most expensive professional courses. So the question of fairness comes in a lot of times when you talk about accommodation. Equitable change is not necessarily seen as fairness. So how do we negotiate that? So that's the first thing that needs to come in. And we need to realize that mental health, psychosocial disability is very, you don't have a set pattern. The chronicity, the rarity, the frequency, all of those things matter. And to have set objective frameworks are not going to help. So we need to see something that's fluid. Yeah, I'll stop.
Thank you very much. No, thank you, both of you. I've really enjoyed this session, and from the sheer number of questions we got in, I can tell that everybody else here really enjoyed it too. We're going to now have it will be a 14-minute break now before our next session. So I will thank our speakers again, give everyone a chance to go get a cup of coffee, and we shall see you back here at 1:45. Thank you so much. Cheers now.
Thank you all. Thank you all.